Listeners, unfortunately, we have to do another one of these introductions. Since we recorded this episode, we lost our beloved Prince Andrew Treat Williams.
Yes, it happened since we recorded. We recorded this last summer, and Treat Williams sadly passed away very unexpectedly. So we wanted to take a second and pay tribute to another fine actor whose work we very much respected and enjoyed.
This was definitely a hard one. I know this is one of Emily's favorite princes in fairy tale theater.
Oh, always my favorite. He always was my favorite. Yeah, this one hurt.
And I really enjoyed him in a lot of films over the years as well, even though, as with most actors, my introduction to them was through fairy tale theater. I really
Same.
liked a lot of his films, and namely one of them that I remembered from the 90s was The Deep End of the Ocean. I really liked that film
That's funny. That was exactly the movie I was going to name. I
with
loved that movie.
Michelle Pfeiffer, right?
Yeah, that was a wonderful movie, and he gave a very deep performance in it. The other movie I think of when I think of Treat Williams was Hair, just a classic.
Oh,
Classic
yeah.
musical, and he was so young and handsome in that movie, and just so full of life. So, yeah, out of all the fairy tale theater princes, Prince Andrew from tonight's episode, The Little Mermaid, was always my personal favorite. So, we didn't want to air this episode without pausing to mention his loss that we feel.
We miss you, Treat.
We do.
But without further ado, here's our podcast episode for The Little Mermaid.
Welcome to tonight's tale, a fairy tale theater podcast. We are going through every episode of fairy tale theater in alphabetical order. I am your host, Emily. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm joined by my always beautiful co-host, Eric.
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm from New York. And we're also joined tonight by a fellow New Yorker, Chris.
Hi, everyone.
Chris.
So, Chris, where are you from?
I'm from the Bronx originally, but I used to live up in Carmel, New York.
Very nice. Close enough.
Close enough.
We're neighbors.
So, tonight we are recapping the episode that I think is a favorite for a lot of us. It is The Little Mermaid. And I think it's a very important episode. It's one of the most famous. It means a lot to me. I think it means a lot to you, Eric, and to you, Chris. So I think this is going to be a very important episode for us.
It's actually one of the last episodes, Emily. It aired on April 6, 1987. It's from the very last season of Fairy Tale Theater, season 6, episode 2. I believe the episode after this is the very last one. So this is the second to last one. The last episode is The Dancing Princesses, obviously, is the series finale, but this was the second to last.
The penultimate.
Yeah.
Very cool. So before we go to our recap, I'm interested, what do we remember? What's the first thing that springs to mind when you think of this episode? Chris, I'm going to start with you.
The first thing I remember is Karen Black.
Oh,
Secondly, Little Mermaid has to be my favorite fairy tale. But what also comes to mind is remembering combing through the aisles of Blockbuster, trying to find something new to watch. So I thought that since I had already seen Splash before, that I would do a comparison. But I also remember rewinding the Playhouse video trailer so I could remember each fairy tale as if I was watching them all at once.
Oh, that's sweet. Eric, what's the first thing that springs to mind when you think of The Little Mermaid?
When I think of The Little Mermaid, this one always stands out because I feel like this one was one of the few that was filmed on location.
Yes, it was.
It was on an actual beach. We didn't have to imagine that we were in a desert like some of the episodes, or wherever they were taking place. Right. This one actually took place on a beach, and it was filmed on a beach, which was really special. I think that helped it being in the last season. That's probably why they saved it for the last season, because they needed the budget. There were a lot of things that they did that they needed the budget for, I feel like, in this episode, and that made it special. I also really had a different story than Christian about finding this episode. This episode was very difficult for me to find. Probably I was a little bit older, maybe like 6 or 7, because the other ones I actually grew up watching when I was very, very young. Probably around 2 or 3, I probably started watching fairy tale theater very, very young. But this one was a little bit later, and it was very hard to find, but I found it and I loved it. So,
well, I have a very different position from both of you. I grew up watching this. I am half Danish, so I grew up going to Denmark, and The Little Mermaid is basically the patron fairy tale of Denmark. That and The Ugly Duckling, probably, but I cannot remember a time when I did not know the original Hans Christian Andersen story of The Little Mermaid. So I grew up watching this, and I remember that this was the adaptation that followed the story. I grew up watching this long before the Disney version even came out. And I'm sure it'll enter our conversation just how different the Disney version came. The other thing that springs to mind when I first think of this episode is the cast. Like you said, Chris, I love Karen Black as the Sea Witch. She was just stunning. I remember Pam Dauber, a fellow Michigander like me. Treat Williams playing my personal favorite Prince Charming in all of fairy tale theater. And Dame Helen Mirren as the other princess. I guess I really remember the cast. Donna McKechnie, Lorraine Newman. It was a very, very strong cast and a strong story. I think that's what really I remember most when I think of this. They got the story right and they had a spectacular cast. Moving into our rewatch. At our very opening, we get Shelley, and she's standing at the piano looking beautiful.
I love this scene because it's one of the first intros. I think it's the only intro where we actually have a teaser while Shelley is talking and with Shelley talking over it. So we have a whole cut scene to a teaser of the prince.
That's true.
Seeing Pearl's sister.
Yeah, I think it was Lorraine Newman.
Lorraine Newman is swimming in the water, and you see Treat Williams, who plays the prince, sees her through his telescope as Shelley is narrating and talking about sailors and seeing mermaids, and just a very ethereal, very beautiful introduction that doesn't cut to the point like all the other introductions do, where she gives you a little intro in a sentence. This goes on for a little bit, and I do love it, and I do think it was a great creative choice and artistic choice for whoever made the decision, and it's beautiful.
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Welcome to Fairy Tale Theater. Ever since sailors have sailed the seas, they have told stories of the mermaids who live in the deep and come to the surface so rarely that they can only be glimpsed by those who know where to look. For the flash of a little white arm in the curl of a wave, for the glint of a tail rippling the waters of a quiet cove. Yet once upon a time, one mermaid did tarry long enough above the surface to encounter a handsome young sailor and to hold him in her arms. This is her story, the story of the Little Mermaid.
But this is true. This is very unique, where she gives her introduction and they pause and they kind of visit the actors and give us a little preview of the episode while Shelley is doing her introduction. I don't think that's ever happened before. We know it didn't happen since. So that makes this episode very unique.
And I don't think it was done by accident. I think it was done to show you that this is a special episode.
I agree.
I love the whole cutting transition that we go from her face and then we go into the fairy tale, but then we go right back to her. And the whole opening scene is just amazing, because then we get, after her introduction, we get into the underwater land, which I think is pretty interesting to see, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yes, then we move into the opening credits and we hear Pam Dauber singing. And I adore Pam Dauber, but we so rarely hear her singing.
Is that really her? Forgive me for
Yes.
jumping in, but is that really her
Yes.
singing? I never knew that she
Pam
could
Dauber
sing.
singing, yes, and she
I did not
rarely
know
ever
that.
sang. So that was a nice surprise.
That's interesting.
Yeah, actually, there were a lot of good singers in this episode. Donna McKechnie, of course, is a Tony winner for a chorus line. But anyways, the introduction, we get to hear Pam Dauber singing that beautiful voice, and we get our cast list. I wrote in my notes, an extremely awful 80s cheesy effect of a mermaid swimming. Oh, it was bad. It was bad. It was bad in the 80s, and I'm sorry it's worse now. But we get our narration by the beautiful Brian Dennehy, who plays King Neptune. And he introduces his daughter Pearl and how she has a beautiful singing voice. Donna McKechnie is the redheaded sister, who I think we decided is Anemone. And Lorraine Newman is the blonde. And we have our very first scene of the episode, which is Pearl, Coral, and Anemone having a little sister chat.
Well, I guess all three of them, they have like this sort of way that they come onto that rock, which I don't know how they did it, but it looked as if they were trying to do something really fast. And it just seemed like they were just rushing to get them to sit on that rock at one specific moment. And then the whole interaction, that whole scene with them is just so heartwarming.
Shall we talk about the hair?
The hair.
The hair being blown all over by a Beyonce wind machine.
We cannot ignore this.
I was waiting for you guys to say it. I didn't want to say it because it was it's going all over the place, and I feel like there's no direction.
Like, I feel they definitely had to stop several times just to get it out of their mouths. Those awful wigs, get the wig out of their mouth.
So bad for the actresses. I'm like, that cannot possibly be comfortable. How in the world are they even managing to get their lines out? God bless them.
I'm sure that they might have like overdubbed themselves while they were doing this whole scene with the windmill going like 20 miles per hour. I'm not sure how fast this was going because it seems like it had a mind of its own.
Yeah, and then in the 80s, I mean, think about it, they didn't probably have concentrated mics like we do now. They probably had to, because those wind machines were probably really, really loud. So
yeah, probably.
Yeah,
now,
pretty smart.
We should probably explain to our listeners exactly what's going on, because I don't think it will make a lot of sense if they're not looking at it. So the scene obviously takes place underwater. And so as a result, all of the mermaid's hair is flying around, as it does for women like me with long hair. When you go underwater, our hair flies up in the air. It was an interesting special effect. It was an accurate special effect, and it was a distracting special effect.
Was it accurate? Your hair really doesn't do all of that when you're underwater.
It was the best they could do in 1987.
Like, a little bit less would have been more.
I also don't wear a crown underwater, so.
Fair. I do have to say that this scene differs a little bit from the original tale, because in the original tale, she has 5 older sisters, and they just whittled it down to 2.
Disney was a little more accurate there then.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that she had 5 sisters. As I recall, in the Disney version, she also had, well, I don't think I counted them, but probably about 5. So that's interesting. Although it does make sense to cut it down to 2 for dramatic purposes. It makes it easier, probably cheaper, to only hire 2 actresses. And they do have a pretty interesting conversation. They are talking about how it's Pearl's first day where she's allowed to go up to the surface, and she's all excited now. Her sisters have already gone, and they're trying to tell her about the world of men, basically.
And the cool thing is that we actually observed her sister having her moment at the surface when the prince sees her.
True. I had not put that together.
Yeah, you're correct. In the Disney version, there was actually 6 though, but they were closer to the original tale. But I do love this interaction because it does set the tone. You know, they're kind of giving you the backstory. In the original tale, it takes a long time to have this whole exposition because you talk to the sisters for so long. And it talks about each of the sisters going to the surface. It talks about each of them because each of the sisters are exactly a year apart.
That's interesting.
So it spends a lot of time on all this. You probably get about to halfway through the story until stuff actually starts to happen with the sea witch and everything. But, you know, it's a lot of this exposition, which I feel like Fairy Tale Theater did a really good job putting together in a nutshell by whittling it down to just 2 sisters. And then, you know, with the father, I think it all worked out really well.
They did the same thing with Dancing Princesses, which we reviewed earlier, and how they went from 12 to 6, which just made a lot of sense. Not just because they could hire less actresses, just because
it's less to keep up with.
I mean, in Disney, it worked so well for, the sisters because they have their big musical number, so it worked out really well with all the sisters that start with A.
It's true.
Atina, Alana, Adela, Aquata, Arista, Andrina.